Well, welcome everyone. I'm Kelly Whitmore. I've met you all, and I'm ALF's program manager. I believe this is our fifth conversation on houselessness, and these conversations evolved from the senior fellows' extreme interest and turnout at our first conversation on this issue. And I will say thank you to Stephanie Hooper of Class 31 and Beth Burns of Class 35, who have helped in the planning and shaping these conversations. And Beth and Jacob Fox of Class 34 actually led the first conversation on houselessness. We had a few meetings that where senior fellows shared their concerns and what's happening in their communities around this important issue. And then Brandy Tuck and Kitty Miller, who I believe are both here, Class 38, did an incredible presentation about how Black, Indigenous, and other people of color face discrimination in securing housing and the disproportionate numbers of these people that endure hardship around housing. And that's recorded. And if you need access to watching it, just shoot me an email. And today, also of Class 38, along with Brandy and Kitty, Greg Holmes is here to delve into Oregon's land use planning. Communities having a housing stock where people earning low income and moderate wages can afford to stay in their homes or secure, safe, stable housing is critical to people not becoming unhoused. So Greg will talk about that. And before I introduce Greg, I will let Lisa Watson, our fearless executive director, welcome you all.
Thank you. Fearless. Ooh, I love that. I'm not sure how true it is, but thanks. I just wanted to jump in and say a quick welcome and acknowledge all of you for taking your time to continue to learn from each other. It's one of the beautiful things I think that exists in this network of people is that we all have such incredible gifts and skills and knowledge. And the gift we get is to get to share that with each other and to receive that from each other. So thank you all for investing in your learning and hearing from Greg and his really incredible career and his expertise in the area of housing and land use. So thank you all for being here, especially when I call out Stephanie Hooper, who's on our board as well. And I'm always so grateful when we have board members show up for our program. So thank you for being here today, Stephanie. Appreciate that. And again, I'm glad you acknowledged Brandy and Kitty for their past contributions to these conversations. And I know that some of you have conversations you're going to be engaging with us in the future as well on housing. So thank you for your interest. Thanks for taking the time. And a huge thanks to Greg for your time and preparation and being here today.
Thanks, Lisa. So Greg Holmes, our speaker today, is Class 38. He lives in Grants Pass. He serves as the Southern Oregon Advocate and Food Systems Program Director for 1,000 Friends of Oregon. He's worked on urban and rural issues in the southwest corner of Oregon for almost 20 years. He works with farmers and other partners to build equitable and sustainable food systems throughout Oregon. In previous lives, Greg has worked also on energy in the energy policy field, transportation advocacy, and as a nonprofit consultant. I got to know Greg through his volunteer work with the ALF Oregon's Urban Rural Connection Project, where I came to appreciate Greg for his thorough and thoughtful thinking and contributions. He reads everything he sent over email, and that makes him an excellent partner in any endeavor you might have. He appreciates people and the lives that they lead. In addition to all the above, you should ask Greg if you ever get the chance about cycling, master gardening, European vacations, or his gig with the Pacific Northwest booksellers. So we are so grateful for Greg's commitment to people and Oregon's working and natural landscapes. Thank you so much for all of your time today, Greg, in preparing for this and your time now. So with that, Greg, before I turn it over to you, we won't do introductions, but we will, if everybody could drop your name, your class, and the community where you live, or the community where you're most engaged in housing, because we will do some breakout groups later, and I'm gonna break you out by community. So it'll just be 3 or 4 people later on. So with that, Greg, it's all you.
Great. Well, thank you, Kelly, for that introduction. Thanks everybody for being here. And I just wanted to shout out to thank you for the class 38 members who are here for your support as well. I need to move this so I can see my notes. Thank you. So I have a lot of information to try to deliver in a fairly short period. So if there's something that I'm saying that really needs to be clarified in real time, go ahead and interrupt me. But otherwise, if we can type questions into the chat or hold on to them, the goal is to try to make room for addressing all of those. And I'm happy to stick around afterwards or follow up by email later if we don't get to things. So thank you for that. We'll try to keep me from going off on too many tangents with questions in the middle. I just want to really start with the recognition that the housing crisis that we have is nationwide and it's complex. There's no one problem here. There's no one cause, and there's no one thing that's going to cure it all. We have lots of factors, including tax policy, finance markets, labor markets, recessions, just the fact that wages have not been keeping up with other costs of living increases, and frankly, lots and lots of just small political decisions from communities around the state and the country that have led to the problem we're in. In the last session, my classmates Brandy and Kitty did a great conversation about systemic racism and bias in housing policies and programs. And one of the things that I really loved about that is they both kind of left us with some hope, and we had some really great, robust conversation at the end, which I hope we can replicate a little bit today. I want to start with a preposition that with all of those different types of problems that we have to address, we can address many of them. But if we don't at least start but even addressing them, we're not even going to put a dent in this problem unless we start building more of the types of housing units that people need and can afford to live in. Without those units, we're just not going to solve this problem. So that's a big part of what I want to talk about. Well, it's the thing I want to talk about today, which is how to facilitate the building of more types of housing to meet the needs of actual people. And in Oregon, what gets built and where it gets built really starts with the land use planning program. And the land use planning program, in turn, is based on the premise that members of the community get a say in what happens in their community. And we're going to end today with some opportunities that you have to help shape what can be built in communities around the state for the next generation. So to do that, I want to start back with a little bit of history to give us all some similar foundation here. Our land use planning program here in Oregon, as we know it today, starts in 1973 with Senate Bill 100. And that was passed with bipartisan support of the types we hardly ever see today, with urban and rural legislators coming out in support, and with pretty good, strong majorities in both houses. And it has withstood 3 attempts of outright appeal at the ballot box since then, and surveys continue to show that Oregonians support the outcomes that have been generated from this program. I want to really stress, though, that this program wasn't created out of whole cloth by the legislature in Salem. What they created was a framework that established something called the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And their first charge was going out and creating the goals that would guide the program. So during 1974, the LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, held meetings and hearings around the state where 10,000 Oregonians came out to help create the 19 goals that you see here that are still guiding the program today. When you think about that, that's pretty astounding. 10,000 people when the state's population was a third of what it is today. I teach like a 30-hour course on how all of this stuff fits together, and we don't have time for any of that today, but I do want to focus today. We're going to focus a little bit on goals 14 on urbanization and goal 10, which is on housing. One criticism that you hear sometimes of the land use planning program in Oregon is that it's this one-size-fits-all thing that's imposed on communities from Salem. That's a brilliant soundbite, but it's not really an accurate description of this program. This program is implemented locally. 36 counties, all 241 cities, they all have their own different comprehensive plans and development codes. And the state program is a framework that they use to create those. And in some cases, it's very prescriptive, and in other cases, it's very permissive. But there are variations in the program and how it rolls out based on the location in the state, the issue we're talking about, the size of the population of your community, the soil types that you're sitting on top of, and other factors. So I like to encourage people not to repeat that mantra of one size fits all. We can have a conversation about whether there's enough variation or not, but it's not accurate to say that it's imposed top down. One aspect of the program that we have here is the idea that the majority of urban uses belong in cities, and that the land outside of the city should primarily be used for economic activity around farming, forest practices, other rural uses, which are strong, which have been and continue to be strong components of our economy. The plan, or the program rather, requires cities to plan for all of the things that are necessary inside their boundaries, including economic activity, transportation, schools, parks, and housing. Goal 14 is what guides how urbanization happens in the state. And it's not just about numbers, but also income levels, economic activity, addressing equity issues, and all of the things that have to happen for people that live in those places. One thing that's required is that every city have an urban growth boundary, which I will call a UGB from now on, urban growth boundary. Every city in Oregon, all 241 of them, has a UGB. And now in places like the Portland metro area, there's 20-some cities that share a common UGB. Salem and Kaiser share one. Eugene and Springfield used to before their divorce. But every other city pretty much has their own urban growth boundary. And to kind of get at the idea, in general, there are very few exceptions to this. In general, every part that's inside the city is also inside of a UGB, but the opposite is not true. Everything that's in a UGB is not inside of every city. The city is the area that the city council has jurisdiction over and can make decisions about what happens there. The UGB is an area outside of the city that the city and the county that it's in agree are the next places the city will expand into. And the city is required to have enough land in its current city limits and in the UGB to provide for 20 years of all of their needs for housing, for employment, for all of the things that they're going to need based on population projections. It's really important to understand that what's outside of the city limits is still, but in the UGB is still governed by the county, not by county land use regulations. The land has to be annexed into the city before the city can start having control over what happens and authorizing development there. The existence of this UGB has also led to another myth, which is that the UGB constrains the land supply, which has driven up the cost of housing. If that were true, neither of these sets of facts would be accurate. Oregon, California and Washington, for instance, don't have UGBs, but their median house prices are higher than ours. If you look at the map on the right, the places where people are spending more than an affordable amount on housing, mostly that's happening in places all over the country where people are moving to and want to live. This is not just an Oregon problem, and most of those states don't have the same kind of urban growth boundary urban growth boundaries that we have. So that is itself is not a cause of this problem. In reality, the urban growth boundaries are not as neat as those circles that I showed you on this map, which is Southern Oregon, the Rogue Valley in Jackson County. The gray areas are inside the cities. The purple areas are urban growth boundaries. Inside that urban growth boundary, like I said, cities must plan to meet 20 years of all of their needs, including housing. And 20 years worth of land should be, if they do it right, plenty for the market to respond to and build on. Once it starts getting used up in a major way, cities are required to figure out how to meet their future needs, either by revising the plans for the remaining land inside the UGB or by expanding the UGBs, and that happens. And it's expensive and it's difficult, but it happens, and it should be difficult. It shouldn't be super easy, or we would just be sprawling out all over the countryside. So within the UGBs, and I want to clarify, Goal 10 on housing applies inside UGBs only. Counties are not required to plan for all of their housing needs. Cities are required to plan for their housing needs, and that's under Goal 10. And I'm not going to read any more of my slides to you, but this one. And I want to read it to emphasize a couple of things. Goal 10 says buildable lands for residential use shall be inventoried, and plans shall encourage the availability of adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels that are commensurate with the financial capabilities of Oregon households, and that allow for flexibility of housing location, type, and density. Cities are required to plan for all of the types of housing that they need. And this, in my opinion, is where the problem is. It's not in the existence of the program, but in the way it's been implemented by city after city across the state. And there's lots of reasons for that. And I'm not saying there's any bad faith here, but it just hasn't been implemented the way that it could have been. And that's the topic of the rest of this presentation. So if you go into your city's comprehensive plan, you will find general statements about the housing policies they have. You'll find a chapter called a housing element. The chapters of the comprehensive plans are generally called elements. And that has all of the policies, the details of the policies for your city in it. And that's usually backed up by a housing needs analysis, which has all of the data and the analysis that went into preparing your plan and the housing policies that your community has. Every city has these. Some of them are woefully out of date, but they exist. Some of the things that you're going to find are data like average household size. And I'm going to emphasize a little bit of the data here to explain why we're in the problem we're in right now. Household size across the country has been declining over the years. Households are getting smaller and smaller. In Oregon, according to the 2020 census, it was 2.51 persons per household, but it goes as low as just under 2.2 per household in Curry County, which is the lowest, and the county that has the most people over 65, the largest percentage of people over 65 in it. And that tells you a little bit about where we're headed here. By 2030, 1 out of 5 people in the US will be 65 and older. And why that's important is because people over 65 tend to live in 1 or 2 person households. Meanwhile, while households are getting smaller, the houses themselves are getting larger, and larger translates in many ways to more expensive. I really want to emphasize the blue line here, which is the single family residential, tend to be detached household housing. Those are getting bigger and bigger as we go. That's true here in Oregon. And at the same time, the amount of land that cities have zoned for those types of houses, in most cities, it's between 65 and something over 80% of all of the residential land in their city is zoned for single family residential, and those houses are getting bigger and bigger. So in most of those zones until very recently, all other types of housing have been prohibited. I want to say that again, in most of those zones, in most of the cities, these other types of housing have been prohibited. Some allowed duplexes on corner lots, for example, but in single family zone land, these other types of homes often have not been allowed. The result has been that we've been paying more and more to build bigger and bigger houses that house fewer and fewer people. And because of that, when people are ready due to age or disability or whatever other economic reasons they need to downsize, in a lot of cases, you have to move out of the neighborhood you've been in for all these years or stay in the bigger house. And it's harder to get started out too. We're seeing more and more projections around the state, like the bottom one there that shows that Salem is projecting a huge surplus of single family zoned land, but a deficit of land zoned for multifamily homes. In 2017, the state economist said that we had a shortage of 110,000 homes for middle income households and a shortage of another 110,000 for lower income households. And we've fallen further behind since then. So that's part of the picture that we have right now, part of the situation we're in. And what's missing, what we don't have in a lot of communities, is very much of this middle housing. And it's really important to understand that, especially at this end of the scale here, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, even courtyard apartments can be built at scales that look a lot like single family dwellings. It's not really changing the look of the neighborhoods or the way they can function to add more of these types of housing in them. So the form is really important in what I'm trying to advocate for here. It's also, I just want to show that, you know, in 100 years ago, nationwide, that type of housing was 25% of our housing stock. Today, it's under 10%. And that's true here in Oregon as well, although I wasn't able to find exact numbers. That kind of scale is true here as well. That is important, going back to that map that I showed you earlier, because 38% or so of Oregon's households are cost burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. We need to build more housing that is affordable for more people. And I want to emphasize really quickly that where we put that housing is important. This is a map that shows where affordable housing is by that 30% definition in the Rogue Valley. The gray areas are areas that there's no data for. The yellow areas are affordable by that definition, and the green areas are not. So taking a look at that 30% of your household income being spent on rent or mortgage being affordable, people started figuring out there's more to affordability for your house than just the cost of the rent. If the place that you live requires you to spend more on transportation than a similar home in another place, it might make an otherwise affordable home not affordable. And people who live in rural areas, especially larger families, tend to need more than one car. So it's very expensive to own a car. These are AAA figures. And if you change the accounting to be housing and transportation equals 45% or less of your income, this is what happens to the affordable housing. It shrinks back into the cities. And this is an example. It's not true everywhere in every case, but generally that pattern holds. So it also matters because it's more expensive for cities and for the community as a whole to put more miles of roads and more miles of pipes and more miles of wires sprawling out all over the place, especially after it's installed, having to operate and maintain that over time. So I want to just end this part by saying, in general, all other things being equal, more homes on less lands tends to be less expensive, not only for the developer, but also for the communities in terms of miles of roads and pipes and operational costs. Smaller homes also use less building materials. Homes with common elements such as walls and yards use less building materials. Both reduce costs of building and maintaining. If people live in places where they can walk to some of the places they need to go or can bicycle, some of them will choose to do so. And in turn, that reduces the impact they have on all of us. Household sizes are getting smaller. Household sizes are getting smaller. We don't need to keep building what we've been building. And in fact, I want to really emphasize, nobody's arguing that we stop building single family detached housing altogether. But we're not going to get out of the problem we're in if we keep continuing to do things the way we did them to get us into the problem. We have to increase the numbers and types of housing options that we build. And that includes retrofitting some of our existing neighborhoods. So to be cost effective. So that's the context. I want to spend just a couple more minutes on some opportunities we have to change some of what I've talked about. Every community, every state, every city in the state has been required to do housing needs analyses when they expand their urban growth boundary. But some of those have been woefully out of date because cities haven't needed to expand their urban growth boundaries. They've also done those analyses in a vacuum, often not really paying attention to neighboring communities and the rest of, say, a commute shed or something. So we have a new requirement from 2019 from the legislature where Housing and Community Services and the Department of Land Conservation and Development are doing regional housing needs analyses. The initial analyses have been completed. There was money in the 2021 legislature to refine some of those studies and figure out how to best use them. But cities over 10,000 now are going to be required to use that data and revise their housing needs analyses more regularly, and for the first time, to create housing production strategies. And I'm not going to go into much detail about what all of those things are, but the important thing here is to note that there's about to be a lot more data than there used to be available, and it's going to be more recent and thus more useful. As far as how to build more stuff on the ground, the 2017 legislature took a start at that by passing Senate Bill 1051, which creates auxiliary dwelling units, which are usually smaller. They have usually, but not always, attached to an existing structure, or at least on the same lot with the existing structure. They're almost always subject to size limits, sometimes design standards. But they're the things that people used to call granny flats and mother-in-law flats. And they were not legal in a lot of neighborhoods. So they are now in every city over 2,500 in all places where single family dwellings are allowed. The legislature took the next step in that regard, and this is where we're headed now with the rest of this conversation, by passing House Bill 2001. Which also said for cities over 10,000, this is again some of that variation that I was talking about. If your city's over 10,000, then on every lot in your city where single family residential is allowed, you must also allow duplexes. And for larger cities, populations over 25,000 and all metro cities above 1,000. So metro is kind of, for planning purposes, treated as one thing. They must allow these other they have to allow duplexes on every lot, like the medium-sized cities, but they also have to allow all of these other housing types in areas where single-family housing is allowed. That doesn't mean on every single lot. That means just in that zone, in the places where it makes sense, they must start allowing those things. Alarmists have been saying that this is outlawing single-family zoning. It's more accurate, actually, to say that it ends the effect of outlawing of middle housing on most of the land in the cities that, as we've had it. It will allow the market to actually decide what types of housing to be built. And all indicators, like I showed earlier, are that there's a lot of demand. So the punchline of this whole presentation is the state has put forth a lot of money to help communities comply with these regulations. And in order to comply, the cities either have or will go through significant public processes and hold public hearings. The decisions that get made in those hearings are going to impact, they're going to dictate really what can be built where for the next generation. These are really important decisions, and you have an opportunity to participate in those decisions. The medium cities that I list here on the left had to comply with Senate Bill or House Bill 2001 by June of this year. All but two, as far as we're aware, have met that deadline, and those two the state law applies directly right now until they get finished. But for those communities, the question is, are they implementing their regulations right? However, for the larger cities, they have until June of next year to come into compliance. And most of those cities have been collecting data and are right now setting up advisory committees and getting ready to start public hearings where they're going to make the decisions on how to comply with this. And many of these cities will also be completing housing needs analyses and housing production strategies required under House Bill 2003 in the next couple of years. So this is the time to get involved in especially these larger cities and anywhere in the metro area. And I want to point out, if you live in a smaller city that's not required to comply with House Bill 2001, there are some smaller cities that are voluntarily complying. Talent and Hood River are two of them. They have adopted some of these elements that they think make sense for their community. So that is, there's a chance. Talk to smaller communities and see what they're doing. And maybe some of these medium cities, especially the ones that are closer to 25,000, can be talked into taking the next step. I'm going to come back after we have a conversation with a little bit more on how you get involved. And I wanted to stop at this point and see if there are questions. And I can't see this chat, so I'm going to stop my share for a minute. But I think we're still a small enough group that is somebody.
So Greg, I'm going to jump in verbally since I probably should jump off, but this has just been incredibly valuable information to me. So I live in, I live in the metro area, but I'm just outside the metro boundary, and I watch with a combination of fascination and bewilderment at the amount of growth that's happening to Oregon City and Canby. And my son is a transportation planner by profession, and the issue is always the last mile, is getting people to where they need to be. So unless these people in Oregon City and Canby are finding work in Canby, and where that is, I don't know, they're all going to Portland, or may even be going all the way to the west side. This just further clogs the freeways. There's no transportation solution. And, but people complain inside Portland city boundaries when we build multifamily. I mean, I hear it over and over again. Oh, down in Selwood, they built all that multifamily, and now there's no parking in town. And aren't those buildings ugly? And I'm like, yeah, but they're close to transit. Those people can get into town and work. I mean, where's the message on this? Is that the solution, to build more multifamily in close? And, because the farmland around Canby is disappearing, and that's inevitable. I mean, my uncles were both farmers, and they became millionaires because they sold their land to housing developers. It worked out for them, but is that the model? So help.
Thanks, great questions and observations. I'll go back to the screen that I showed with all of the goals of the program on it and say their goal 12 is transportation, and transportation planning is supposed to happen in concert with housing and urban planning, ideally. And, so is economic opportunities and economic development. And so ideally, you create these walkable, more dense neighborhoods. You have to have somewhere for them to walk to and destinations for them. So they need to have some shopping opportunities and possibly some jobs and other things nearby, or they're going to need to have still mobility to get to the places that they need to be. The idea of building it near transit is that maybe some of those people will have that option and won't need as many cars, so parking is not as big of an issue. That having to provide off-street parking for housing units, especially multiple off-street parking spaces per unit, is incredibly expensive. And that's one good way to be able to reduce the cost of housing, is to reduce parking requirements. That has trade-offs and other impacts that have to be dealt with. And the thing around ugly buildings, well, maybe a design review board or something. But it can be done. In fact, the photo that I was just showing on the slide here with the questions on it, those are examples of, I think, potentially some attractive-ish, at least, opportunities, and there are certainly other ways to do that as well. So anyway, let's see if there's another question or two, and then I think we're going to split into groups, and then I will make time to answer any other questions that are unanswered.
Greg, my name is Jacob, class 34. Had a question for you, and I came 10 minutes late, so this may have been in your slide deck, but I'm curious about sort of population influx into Oregon, kind of compared to the housing supply that's being delivered. And I don't know if you touched on that, but any sort of thoughts you had on that. I've heard things like 40,000 people a year are migrating to Oregon, and we're building about 20,000 units a year. And I don't know if that's true fact, but I'd just be interested in your perspective on
that. Thank you. There are several studies. I showed you, or I mentioned the figures from the State Economist in 2017 that said at that time we were about 220,000 units down, and that we would have to build 30,000 or more units a year for many, many years to keep up. It is true, people are coming here fast, and it is true that we're not keeping up, and there are different sets of numbers. Margaret Salazar just posted something in the chat that says, according to this one source, we underbuilt, and from 2000 to 2015, we underbuilt by about 150,000 units. I would be surprised if we've closed that gap in the last few years. There are some resources, but I don't offhand have one of them so that I can cite for you on that. But in general, those trends are definitely happening. Let me ask if there's a, this is not a huge group. Would you rather break into smaller groups, or would you rather stay here and have a bigger conversation?
Actually, before that, Greg, Jeff had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see.
Yeah, hi, Greg. That was a terrific PowerPoint. That is really a good presentation. Thank you. The legislation we passed to mandate multifamily development where single-family residences are allowed split the Democratic caucus, not down the middle, but I have colleagues who are quite dedicated to improving housing generally and affordable housing, who couldn't bring themselves to vote for it because they were getting so much pressure from constituents. And I'm going to say more affluent people, not to allow the fragmentation of their nice, lovely mature tree neighborhoods. And I don't expect that dynamic to go away. And I know, those of us who follow city government know when there's a significant multifamily development proposal, you're going to get a big NIMBY pushback. So I'm curious what you know and what's developing about a strategy to deal with that.
That's, of course, a tough, big question. I think one of the best things that can happen is for people to come out and give their local decision makers and their legislators the political cover to do the right thing. Show them that you support, show them that this is supported, and find the examples where it's working out and it's not bringing people's worst fears to fruition. I can show you several examples of neighborhoods where people came out of the woodwork to oppose a subsidized affordable housing development. That development eventually was put in, and it brought the neighborhood up because it's nicer and it's managed better than most of the rest of the neighborhood. examples like that, and like where tucking a few ADUs and a couple of duplexes into an existing neighborhood don't significantly change the way that the neighborhood looks or operates. Finding those examples and letting people get familiar with those things. And I know from working in Southern Oregon for years, I can't show an example of something that happened in Portland and say, see, it works. They say, well, it works there, but we're different. Well, yeah, no. You know, and when you get down to a neighborhood scale, it's not that different, really. So we 1000 Friends Oregon are doing a lot of organizing right now around implementation of this bill and helping city councils come up with good implementation policies. And the next step, as you mentioned, is going to be once projects start being proposed. The reality is most of this stuff is going to be built in new neighborhoods. The reality is some of it is going to be retrofitted into old neighborhoods. And in some cases, that's going to have bad impacts. And in some cases, it's going to not have much of an impact at all. And what we all need to do, I think, is work towards minimizing or eliminating the negative impacts. And some people, no matter what happens, are just not going to like it. But I think there is no easy answer to that question. It's a great question, but I think the big thing is getting people out to say this is an important issue. It's going to cost us too much to stick all of this out on the edges in places. We need to bring it in where we already have transit and transportation infrastructure, and it's got to be done. So let's figure out how to do it in a way that with acceptable trade-offs.
This is Carol. Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay.
I think Kelly, I think what we're going to do is probably stick, unless people, I think we're going to stick with the larger conversation. There just aren't that many people.
I like it.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, so I live in a neighborhood that has, in Portland, Northeast Portland, that has been having this conversation as new things have gotten passed. And when I can talk to neighbors about this, they'll say, well, I don't care if it's a duplex, but I just don't want the McMansions. That's what scares people, that this in a one that has average size homes on an average size block, they're afraid of the big one, the big ostentatious one. At least that's what they say. So how are you seeing jurisdictions handling that issue in terms of kind of differentiation between multi-units versus the one big one? So.
Yeah, and that is, I know that neighborhood pretty well. When I go to Portland, I stay up there in Northwest or Northeast rather. I've seen good examples of that. And frankly, most of the ones that I'm aware of are huge single family houses. They're not things with ADUs or duplexes. So that can be dealt with in any of several ways. There are regulations that a lot of cities have as far as like the percentage of the lot that can be covered by the building, and a height restriction. So you can only fit so much into that box, right? So if the height restriction will only allow two stories, then you might not be able to do a daylight basement underneath it. So that takes your third story out. And if it's on a small lot and you have setbacks and a maximum percentage of the lot that can be covered, that restricts the size of the footprint. Those are some examples of kinds of things that can be done. I've seen minimum and maximum lot sizes, but I have not seen restrictions on like a maximum amount of square footage. Usually it's that envelope kind of thing that I was talking about, at the footprint times the height. Certain places, it makes sense to allow more than others, say along a transit corridor, maybe the first block in, and then from there you transition. And that's where the different types of housing under House Bill 2001 on the larger cities, where it says areas must allow all of these things. Well, maybe the first block off of a transit corridor, you allow some of the bigger structures that have more units in them. And then the next block or two, you go to triplexes and cottage clusters. And then from there on, if you get further from the transit corridor, you only allow duplexes. That kind of a pattern makes sense, and it protects some of the neighborhoods that are further in. But there are some ways to deal with that, but there's also people who are going to do whatever they can get away with based on what's allowed. Thank you for the question. Is there another question from someone? I was trying to, Stephanie, yeah.
So Greg, there's obviously different challenges for urban and rural areas. Mm-hmm. What are some rural solutions that you're seeing for these communities that may not have, that may not be attractive to developers because of the smaller size of their projects, or may not have the local financing capacity and whatnot and expertise to execute more affordable housing?
So let me again say the definition of urban and rural as I'm using it here. And I think it's slightly different than what you're talking about. When I'm saying urban, I mean inside of an urban growth boundary or inside of a city. And those can be, you know, Chiloquin at 700 and some people, or Dufur or Portland. I mean, all of those communities. A lot of people consider basically all of Southern Oregon, excluding Medford maybe, to be rural. So I live in a town of 40,000 people that I hear described as rural all the time, Grants Pass, right? So I think you're talking about smaller cities, right? You're not, as opposed to outside of the cities, okay. That's a tough question. And that's one of the things that I was talking about at the beginning. There's lots of different parts to this problem, and finance is one of them. And having the labor force there to build the things once you get it financed is another challenge. I don't know how to address some of those questions, but if the community doesn't have the land zoned to allow that kind of a development in the first place, then they have an extra hurdle to go through, which is rezoning some land in order to put a project on, which sometimes brings out lots of opposition because I don't want those people next to me. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that in a hearing. Don't approve this. We don't want those people in our neighborhood. So if the city already has land that's zoned to allow the kind of development, that's a huge hurdle that's off the plate once somebody maybe can come in. I've heard the executive director of the Jackson County Housing Authority say multiple times in communities like Talent and Phoenix and Eagle Point, they can compete on the open market for the land if there is enough land that's properly zoned so that they can get in and put up projects on it. But if they don't have the land already properly zoned, they've had too many bad experiences with trying to get that done. So I don't know the answer to your question, except that let's get all the hurdles out of the way. And the land use one is a pretty easy one to get out of the way before you even start having the conversation about how to finance it.
And then Mike had his hand raised, Mike Marshall.
Hi, everybody. And Greg, I sincerely apologize. I came in a half hour late. So if you already said this, but I'm curious as we think about economic disparities. We talk a lot about how wealth has been transferred to, the top income earners in this country. But if we also look at the middle class, we look at how a percentage of monthly income that's spent on housing, I believe, has gone from like 20 to 40% over the last 30 years. Is there a mechanism to be able to say we can get back to that 20% or 25%, whatever like was the best year? Is there a mechanism for figuring out how many housing units we need and what kind of housing that needs to be in order? And is that the metric we should be driving towards as like, how do we make it so every Oregonian pays less in housing costs so they have more money to spend on other things?
I think some of the regional housing needs analyses that are being done right now are going to provide some of the information to answer that question with. And, you know, not to sound flip, but part of, you know, basic economics 101 is you provide more supply and that cost comes down, right? And we have a demonstrated lack of supply of the types of housing that many people would choose to live in if they had that as an option. So building, you know, getting more of these types of housing built in the places that people want to live is a big part of bringing that cost down. I think you'll get more data and more numbers and more precision of an answer out of some of those regional housing needs analyses that I mentioned earlier. And I'm sure, you know, Margaret Salazar, who was here earlier, may have a study that she can put her hands on. But the trend that you're talking about, where middle-class families are being squeezed out of the housing market because they're spending more and more of their income, that's absolutely happening. And part of what that does is it pushes them either to live way beyond their means and have financial issues, or it pushes them down into lower tier housing, which pushes the people below them out the bottom and causes more houselessness. So there we go. We just tied this to the the purpose of the whole conversation, right? Houselessness. So yes, that's a problem, and there probably are numbers out there. I don't have my hands on any of them easily.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question real quick. If you had to grade the state's sort of management of this, or driving towards some sort of solution here, statewide, not just that I appreciate that these are very regional issues, but at the same time, there needs to be, in my mind, some state direction and leadership. How would you grade that state direction and leadership currently?
Well, in general, I think that the state, and there's lots of parts to what that means, has not paid enough attention to making sure that the communities did what they were supposed to do under the existing land use planning program. And part of that means they also didn't give the communities enough money to do some of what they needed to do. That's changing now with some of the things that I was talking about and some other bills that I just didn't have time to mention. So I'm hopeful that we're seeing improvement coming up, but I would say just as a state and as a collection of communities, we have not done very well up to this point. I want to share my screen one more time really quickly to emphasize what you can do about this to get involved right now. Again, for the larger cities, and Metro, they are doing this work right now. Bend had a hearing at their planning commission last week, and it's the first of the large communities that I had on that slide that we're aware of that have actually had a public hearing, not like an informational session, but an actual hearing to make decisions of the large cities. Most of the rest of the cities are still, some of them are even establishing advisory committees. I'm on 2 right now, one of which hasn't even met once yet. So they're in that early stage, and they will be having hearings, most of them no later than in the winter and spring, because by June of next year, they have to be in compliance with this law. So if you're in one of those larger cities, find out, you know, contact your planning department and find out where they are and what they're doing and what the public input process could look like. Educate your neighbors about why this is important, and you know, use your voice. For the medium cities, again, a lot of them are in compliance now. It's a matter of implementation and maybe encouraging them to go a little bit further. And smaller cities can voluntarily comply with this. They're not prohibited from doing so. So if you're connected to a smaller city, that's certainly an option. And I just wanted to, lost track of my controls here. Just wanted to put this last piece up to learn more. If you do a Google search for Oregon DLCD, which stands for Department of Land Conservation and Development, housing resources, you'll get a page that has links that describe House Bill 2001, House Bill 2003, the regional housing and needs analyses. I know Housing and Community Services has some resources, and they and DLCD are doing these regional housing needs analyses. In your own community, contact your planning department and just ask. That's their job. And our organization is doing organizing in communities around the state on this. So if you are interested in more information or want to get tapped into that, reach out to me and I can connect you with the people on our staff that are doing that work or that know more about it. So that's what I want to leave you all with. And again, I'm happy to hang out and answer questions, or if you want to contact me, I'll respond with whatever I can give you. And again, thank you for coming out and listening. And I'm going to stop.
Hey, and then I want to invite Zan. I believe Zan had a question. So if Zan is still here and wants to ask a question, ask away.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the House Bill 2003 and the regional housing needs analysis. And I am wondering whether beyond providing better data in terms of context for the municipalities, whether it will also include any kind of incentives for the municipalities to collaborate. For instance, down where you are along that corridor you showed us in your map, between Ashland and Medford, or for us across Valley, Lynn, Lincoln, Benton, or up to Salem and Corvallis, Albany. We can only do so much, but it's really a larger problem, and that nested hierarchy of planning is something that we don't do well, and it's particularly true for the houseless issues, but housing issues as well. And I see it in the transportation systems plans too. I mean, there are all these little separate little patchworks.
Yep. Yes. One of the things that has happened over the course of the 50 years, almost 50 years that the planning program has been in place, is most cities do their own planning, often with very little cooperation or connection or collaboration with adjacent or nearby communities. Something that happened in the Rogue Valley was in the late 1990s, they got together and decided that they wanted to do a regional plan which collaborated on eventually on coordinated urban growth boundary expansions, and they moved some of the needs from some communities to other communities, which is allowed. It's always been allowed under the planning program, but it doesn't happen very often. But one of the great things that came out of that plan, which was approved by the state in 2012, is the planning directors from those jurisdictions still get together once a month and sit in a room together and talk. And I am privileged to be a part of that group. And I'll tell you, the conversations are amazing. They say, hey, I'm having a problem with this. Is anybody else? How about, what do we do about this thing that affects this corridor that 4 of the cities are part of? And they still continue to do that kind of planning. That takes, it's allowed, it's always been allowed, it's not prohibited, but it takes a change in the culture a little bit, because some of those communities never talked to each other before this happened. And I know, I used to live in Klamath Falls, and when I lived there in the 90s, the county and the city would not talk to each other. I think that's over with now, but that culture just has to be broken down, and people have to talk. And that's, the example of the Rogue Valley, politically, the area is fairly hostile to the land use planning program, but I think there's some of the best and some of the most coordinated planning in the state is happening down here among the professionals.
Thank you. That's good to know. And it'd be nice if there were some sort of incentive to get that culture change to go forward.
So I think that the regional housing analyses will help. And the fact that cities now are required to produce housing production strategies, which is a new thing, I think some of them are going to look around and say, how are we going to do this? We better start talking to some of our neighbors and see what we can, you know. I think that has the opportunity to encourage that kind of collaboration.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I'm happy to have conversations like this anytime. So reach out if that's of interest. And otherwise, I guess we're done. Kelly, do you have something you need to wrap us up with?
Just a huge thank you to you. Applause either through the screen or through the chat. But Greg, you've gotten lots of kudos in the chat. And for everyone else, like I mentioned at the beginning, this will be recorded. This was recorded, and I will send you the link along with any of the resources that were dropped in the chat. And look for more conversations on houselessness coming soon. And I think with that, that's it. So thanks, everyone. So good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Greg.